You're exhausted, bone tired, and you've been running on empty for so long, you can't remember what feeling rested actually is like. And yet, when you get to sit down and have a moment to yourself, your body won't let you rest. So your mind carries on racing, your shoulders still feel tense, or you're scrolling and twitching, and your mind is just racing. You can't switch off. Wired but exhausted, that's the phrase, isn't it? When most people will tell you that's anxiety or burnout, or that you just need better sleep hygiene, a bit less caffeine, and more discipline. But there's a word for what's actually happening in your body. And once you know it, everything starts to make a bit more sense. The word is hyperarousal. And that's our H in the A to Z of somatic healing, essentially. So by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why you can be exhausted and unable to rest in the same breath, and why this happens so often to you if you're a woman living with trauma or late diagnosed ADHD, and what your nervous system actually needs to come out of it, which, spoiler alert, is not calm down or try harder to relax. So hi, if you're not met me before, I'm Mercedes. I work with people in somatic practice. I've been working in this kind of realm for over 10 years, at least. And obviously what I'm sharing with you as well is my own experience from having been through these things, worked through them, found solutions, found different ways to approach it. And that's what I share in my videos. So the way we're going to go through this video is I'm going to start with explaining to you what hyperarousal actually is and why that gives you the wired but exhausted experience, and why, if you're a woman with trauma or late diagnosed ADHD, why it's almost inevitable for hyperarousal to be triggered. And we're going to look at the signs that you're in hyperarousal. They're probably things you've been calling something else for a very long time. And then I'm actually going to give you some clear guidance and some steps for what actually helps, and allow you to try a few different things that can help to release that hyperarousal feeling. So, what is hyperarousal? Well, it's when your nervous system is in an activated state. So you can call it sympathetic activation, you'll hear people say, but it's that fight or flight, when we're stuck in that fight or flight. And we're kind of like too much towards the end dial. So we're kind of living with a small amount of activation within the nervous system all the time. So all we're doing is just topping up the activation and never coming back to base. And when we're stuck in that can be really, really exhausting, right? Because we are never able to rest and digest and calm ourselves down, because we are in fight or flight. And you can't just say to someone in fight or flight, well, calm down, because what we've now triggered is the constant stream of fight or flight, because we've had no way to resolve the issues. So often when we go into fight or flight, something happens big, and we can have this happen to us. You know, in the old days, yes, it was being chased by animals and all this sort of stuff, but we'll have something like you'll have a big fright, like your kid nearly runs out in the road, or you hear a loud noise and you get a fright, and your nervous system triggers the fight or flight response. You realise you're safe and you calm down. What happens is when we are triggered by things that don't have that kind of energy and then to stop, we kind of live with this constant trigger of fight or flight. So the hormones that it produces, like the cortisol and the adrenaline, they're constantly just drip feeding into your system. So it might be that really long email list that you've got to go through, or the constant. And one of the things that can actually cause like constant fight or flight is having our phone notifications beep, 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 because they go off all the time. I've turned most of my notifications on my phone off because they were driving me insane. And actually it feels like an interruption into your day every time you get a notification. And a little thing like that can constantly trigger the fight or flight response, but we don't actually get a relief from that fight or flight properly, because we don't have the time to come back down. So we're constantly dripping in that cortisol and adrenaline into the body. And when we do that, that uses an enormous amount of energy. So it really will deplete you. But the stress hormones are still in your system. So they're keeping you switched on. So they're keeping you alert and awake and looking and hypervigilant, if you want. So you're looking for the risk. But you actually are exhausted because you've been looking for that risk for a very long time. So it's a bit like if you were driving a car and you had the handbrake on, and we've all done it where you kind of moved away and the handbrake has still been on and you've still managed to move away a bit, and the car really, really does not like it. And the engine will rev and you'll burn through fuel really, really quickly if you do it. And you don't really go anywhere because you're going to move really, really slowly, and the whole system starts to wear down. And that's essentially what we're doing to ourselves when we're living in this state of hyperarousal. So it's why you can be exhausted to the bones. You're completely exhausted, but you then can't sleep. So because you've still got the cortisol and adrenaline running through the body. And this can happen for lots of different reasons, for that constant drip. I get this particularly if I do a lot of physical activity in a day. So I exert myself beyond what my comfortable limits actually are. And then I will still have too much cortisol and adrenaline pumping through my body, and my body almost hasn't been able to discharge it, or it's creating more and more because I've pushed myself to this limit. And then I think I should be totally exhausted because I've done all this physical work, but I can't sleep because I'm now wide awake because my body is still preparing me for, well, is there something wrong? And that can happen with that constant drip through our days into the fight or flight. And it's really important because often what we can then do is we then add these stories to it, like we're lazy, or we're overwhelmed, we're burnt out, we're exhausted, and all of these negative stories come in. And actually what they do is trigger our nervous system even more. So they actually push us more into fight or flight. So they're doing the opposite of solving the problem. We're then creating those extra stories in our head that make it worse. So if you're experiencing this feeling of hyperarousal, you might want to know why. And why, if you suffer from trauma or you're a woman who has been late diagnosed with ADHD, it's almost inevitable that you are going to be in hyperarousal. And so if we look at trauma, especially if you had early trauma, so particularly, say for me, I grew up with a father who was an alcoholic and I experienced lots of domestic violence. Growing up in that kind of unpredictable, unsafe or chaotic environment, that will teach the nervous system that staying alert is the safest thing it can do. And when I was younger, I mean, I've released some of this, and partly that's to do with ADHD, but anyway, that's a whole nother story. When I was younger, it was all about control. So everything had to be controlled. My environment had to be very rigid. And that was my way of making things predictable when they were unpredictable. But that was still because I was living with that alertness. And when that happens, your body will learn that if I scan, if I anticipate, if I stay one step ahead, then I'm less likely to be hurt. I'm less likely to experience what I experienced as a child. And actually, it's a really brilliant adaptation that our nervous system has created to keep us safe. But the problem is that the nervous system doesn't know when to turn it off. So it's now switched it on, and we're now stuck in this like hyper-vigilant state, hyper-aroused for something dangerous to happen when actually we're perfectly safe. And if you're late diagnosed ADHD, now often they go together. So often people who have ADHD, particularly women, will have experienced trauma. And if you're late diagnosed ADHD, then the chance of you having experienced trauma are very, very high. So that adds a whole nother layer to this whole dimension, because the ADHD nervous system is already wired for fast scanning and high alertness and that rapid input processing. So it's designed for that, even if it hasn't experienced trauma, although it probably has. And then you add to that a lifetime of masking. So we're performing neurotypical, predicting what others need and monitoring our own behavior to make sure it lands right. And you've got a nervous system that has been on duty constantly for decades. So it's quite a lot going on. And then add in the fact that if you have ADHD, you may well have rejection sensitivity dysphoria. And even if you don't have ADHD, you may suffer from some element of this because of the trauma that you've experienced. So now you're scanning every conversation for signs of disapproval or rejection, which is very similar to if you experience trauma, you're scanning that conversation for, are you safe? So if you've had both of these, which is highly likely, the load is enormous. So your nervous system has been doing the work of 3 or 4 nervous systems at once for your entire life. And when you actually put that into perspective, you're doing amazingly well, right? But hyperarousal isn't a glitch in this system. It's the predictable, logical outcome of running that load for years and no language for it and no permission to stop. So we haven't allowed ourselves that ability to stop. So now you know this kind of like outline of it. What are the signs that you're in hyperarousal? So a lot of the things you might notice are trouble falling asleep, even when you're completely exhausted. So I suffer from this quite a lot if I allow myself to particularly get worked up on an issue towards bed, and I will stay very hyper aroused, or like I said, if I do too much physical activity. Or if you wake up in the middle of the night, so 3 a.m., that sort of time, with your mind racing and having to try and fix these problems. So when I'm in a bout of insomnia, I will sometimes find it very hard to go to sleep, and then I'll get really tired. So I'll go to sleep early. But then my body will wake me up in the middle of the night, and I'm awake for like 2 or 3 hours in the middle of the night because it's still got this stuff it wants to process. You may also notice things like jaw tension or shoulder tension, or like feelings around the solar plexus where you can feel that kind of churning and churning in the stomach. And you may also be, because you're on edge, easily startled by things that happen. So you'll see this with people who have PTSD, which is where the kind of like trauma side comes into it. So sounds or sudden movements, someone walking up behind you can make you jump, and it can really trigger the fight or flight response. And you may have real difficulty sitting still. So I know somebody who has some of these symptoms, and they find it very hard to even stop what they're doing. So they are in perpetual motions, having to clean, tidy, work, do all the time. And they find it very hard to actually shut that down and stop. And you may also start scanning conversations for tone shifts and wondering if something's wrong. So you're constantly analysing what's happening around the people that are around you. And emotionally, some of the things that you might feel are like you're on the verge of tears 1 minute or ready to rage the next. Or you can be both at the same time, but all these things that you feel like you're kind of like on your emotional edge, if you will. And one little thing is going to tip you over that edge, but you don't really know what has put you on that emotional edge. You just know you're there. And one of the things that can happen quite strongly when you're hypervigilant is you can have a real crash in the afternoon. So 3, 4 o'clock. I used to have this when I don't really suffer from this anymore, but I would fall asleep in the afternoon almost every single day because I was just so exhausted. Or you just can't do anything. But then it gets to 9 o'clock in the evening, you're wide awake, you're buzzing, and you feel like there's loads to do. And that kind of buzzing feeling is part of the hyperarousal. So when you feel that buzzing, that's kind of all part of it. And what we often do is call all of this anxiety, right? So we just label it anxiety, and then we're told to manage it as anxiety. But actually it's a nervous system state and not a thought pattern, because anxiety is a thought pattern. Hyperarousal is a nervous system state. And that distinction matters because it changes how you approach it. So we're not trying to change the way that we think, we're trying to change the way that our body feels. So some of the things that can make it worse is trying to force yourself to calm down. So when we try and do a top-down approach, so we tell ourselves to relax, to push through, or we add caffeine to the morning to function, right? So we're now adding extra things that are going to make our nervous system hypervigilant. And then other things that can make it worse are actually trying to do long, intense meditation practices, because that can actually like make you feel more anxious because your mind is wandering, and then you think, I'm doing it wrong. And this is when you get into that whole thought pattern of like, I can't come down, and your mind starts worrying because you're trying to sit and force yourself to be quiet. So what can help is to give your nervous system small repeated experiences of felt safety. So it's not the idea of safety, but allow your body to actually experience that safety in small little doses so that you can begin to build that safety up. So it can be something as simple as a long, slow exhale, where we make the exhale longer than the inhale. You can't be in a state of fight or flight or hyperarousal when your exhales are long and slow. So 3 breaths of just inhaling and then blowing out the breath. Inhale, blow out the breath. And one more, inhaling and exhale. And stop, just allow the breath to return to normal. And you'll notice straight away that brings the energy down, because when you do those long, slow exhales, you immediately tell your nervous system, I am safe. When we are in fight or flight, or sympathetic activation, if you will, because you can have positive sympathetic activation and it will do the same thing to you. Your inhales will dominate and your exhales will get shorter. So think of it like this: when you are scared and you're panicking, you inhale and inhale and inhale, and you don't really exhale very much. And the same thing happens when you're exercising and you're running and you feel great, you're inhaling. Your exhales are not that big if you actually pay attention to yourself. Or when you're excited, you breathe in lots, right? But you don't exhale. So they're all examples of sympathetic activation. Some are good, some are stress inducing. But all of them are sympathetic activation. So when we feel that, when we want to come out of that state, because that's when our hyperarousal will kick in, we want to trigger the parasympathetic system, which is when it's the more rest and digest and the calming state. And we're often taught, oh, this is the great one, this is the good one we want to be in. But actually, that's not true, because they're both good and they're both bad. We will switch between them depending on the task that we're doing. What we want is positive activation of both. So if we're feeling a negative activation of our sympathetic nervous system, or a positive one that's excitement and we're getting overexcited, because that's another thing that can happen when we're in hyperarousal. We get overexcited and we can't come down from that. That's when we do those slow inhales. We trigger the parasympathetic nervous system and we calm everything down just a little bit. The other thing that you can look at doing is discharging that energy. So I obviously did a video about discharge, which you can go back and look at in the A to Z of somatic healing. But this is where we want to release that built up pressure in the body. And that's when we can do a shaking. So you can start shaking your body out, give everything a really good shake, move it around, put some music on, dance, really allow everything to move through your body. And that can be a big help to bring down the energy as well. And another thing that is really significant, and another thing that I've actually done a video on already as well, is co-regulation. So this is time with safe humans or animals or in nature, somewhere where we feel safe and that we can use it to help us co-regulate. Because our nervous system is designed to settle in the presence of other regulated nervous systems, because we're not supposed to do it alone, and we can't necessarily do it alone. So if you find yourself in that state of hyperarousal, find a way. So I know when I feel really bad, actually sitting there with my cat and giving them a stroke and having a cuddle really helps to bring me back to that calm state. And one of the things to kind of note is the shift that you're looking for is not a big dramatic release. It's small and it happens gradually. And it's just lots of tiny little moments where over time, your nervous system gets the message and you can come down. You're allowed to rest. And the more you do that practice, the more you do the little things that put you into the parasympathetic system, that make you feel calm, the easier it will be to find that and to switch into it. So just remember that it might take time to land in your body, for you to learn it, to really kind of take that on. But you can do that through small little practices that you build into your day. So if that resonated with you, if you're wired but exhausted, and that's been your default for a long time, please give this video a like and a subscribe, and drop below your thoughts and your feelings. I'd love to interact with you and see you in the comments, because that will help me reach more people with this message as well. And if you want to go deeper into nervous system regulation, especially if you're navigating trauma or late diagnosed ADHD, I've got a group on school called the Somatic Reset Lab. You can join with a free trial, come and see what it's all about and see if you like it. I'd love to see you on the inside.